Muito boa tarde. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our third session on the Brazil's bicentennial, the independence of Brazil, as we commemorate this event in a joint venture with the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, PBBI, from California State University, Fresno, and with the Portuguese language program from our sister university just up the road, California State University Stanislaus. It is nice to have two of the 23 campuses of the CSU system working together when it comes to Portuguese, Brazilian, the Lusophone world. I believe that the campuses need to get more and more together to promote these wonderful events. So I want to thank Professor Renato Alvim for taking the challenge with me, for agreeing to co-sponsor this event. This is our third day. We end tomorrow with a panel discussion about the Brazilian diaspora in California with 4 different folks from different parts of the state, and with Brazilian music at the end to commemorate Brazil's bicentennial, a Brazilian artist who lives in the Bay Area of Northern California. So once again, on behalf of the of PBBI from Fresno State, the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, and also our Portuguese language program, on behalf of California State University, Fresno, and Stanislaus State, welcome. And we want to thank our sponsor, FLAD, the Luso-American Development Foundation from Lisbon, Portugal, for sponsoring these 4 days for us. So I'll turn it to my colleague and very dear friend, Professor Renato Alvim.
Obrigado, Diniz. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining forces once again, and for supporting also our program, our Portuguese program, and for bringing us together on this much important date and celebration. And tonight, or this afternoon, we have 2 professors who are going to present about mostly the Amazon or the Amazonian challenges and works that they have been doing. We start with, I'd like to thank both. We start with Professor Richard Wallace from California State University, Stanislaus, who is going to present about rubber tappers in the Brazilian Amazon, forest livelihood, and the struggle for independence. Professor Dr. Wallace, Richard Wallace, is a cultural anthropologist, broadly trained in multiple disciplines. He earned his bachelor's degree in marketing from Miami University of Ohio, and master's degree in international development from American University in Washington, D.C., and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Florida. His prior research was in the southwest Brazilian Amazon state of Acre, working with the rubber tapers, and currently work in the Colombian Amazon in the state of Amazonia, working with indigenous artisans, and examines the intersection of economics and the environment. In particular, how markets impact cultures and forests. He is a co-editor of the book Etnobotanica and E Botânica Econômica do Acre. Bem-vindo, Richard Wallace, a palavra.
Thank you very much. Let me go ahead and share my presentation here. I think that's good. First of all, thank you very much, Renato and Denise, for putting this wonderful session together, and really for putting the series of sessions together. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to participate. And I also wanted to say, we were talking earlier, but I want to say it's great to see Eduardo Brondizio, because we cross paths, I think, every few years, and it's always a pleasure to be part of something that he is. He's such a wonderful researcher and expert on the Amazon. So let me kind of get started, what I want to do today is, in terms of the theme of independence, look at the struggles the rubber tappers in the Southwest Amazon region had as they were confronting ranchers in the 1970s and 1980s. But to do that, what I really want to do is start out with is give you a little bit of cultural context, a little history, because then that will take us down into the region and let us understand a little bit better, how did this conflict emerge? And then to think about some of the ways that the rubber tappers, some of the ways that they were able to confront the ranchers and in this struggle and eventually gain some type of independence, particularly access to land. So let me go ahead and take us down to the Amazon region. So this is just the basin. Can you see my kind of thing there? Okay, awesome. So this is the Southwest Amazon where I work, the state of Acre, and that's where we're going to focus today. It's a particularly interesting region because that particular area has large tracts of rubber trees, and that's important, and I'll get to that in a second. So here we are again with a kind of more localizing ourselves in terms of some of the larger cities in the Amazon region. And again, I'm over here in Rio Branco, and just south and west of there's a small town called Chapuri. It's not on this map, but this is the area that I worked for many years with rubber tappers to learn about their livelihoods and some of the problems they've had over the years and how they've overcome them. So first, this is a rubber tree. I think we can take a look and feel a bit more comfortable with kind of what are we talking about when we say tapping rubber tree and where does rubber come from? So a couple of things you see here. It's a pretty large tree and it has a lot of cuts in it. That's where it's been tapped or cut. And you can see a couple cups there along the side where the latex drips into that area. So one thing we know is they've probably been doing this for a long time. So this is a type of labor, a way of making a living that has passed through generations across families. So it's a very important economic activity, but it's a pretty defining aspect of rubber tappers themselves. So that's also important to think about as we move forward. Now, what I'd like to do is take just a moment and show a very brief video of tapping rubber, so then it can also give us a little bit more context of what we're saying when we're tapping rubber.
Mas lá do outro lado. E vai lá não corre agora não, deixa ele chegar aí. Vou pegar a costa logo. Daqui. Vou pegar pelo talvez, quero. Vai passando pra lá,
Okay, so just a couple things. It's a pretty labor-intensive activity. You can see that those cut, and it's a technology that's, the equipment itself may not be modern in the sense of what we might think of. That's a tool that is very efficient, so it hasn't really changed over many decades. I will say that they don't usually tap two sides of the tree at once. They were tapping both sides I was shooting the video and they both wanted to tap the tree. But you can see how that cut is made and how the liquid drips into the cup. So it is a pretty, again, a high labor. And for each cut, you can see they put a little cup there. So they're not getting a lot of latex out of each cup. So we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. So a rubber tapper will normally, they leave early in the morning. They'll cap one rubber trail. And again, I'll get to an image of that in a second. And then they'll come back in the afternoon and the latex has accumulated in this cup. This was the technology when I was working there in the 90s up to about 2010. So they come back a little in the afternoon, the latex is in the cup, then they'll take the latex and kind of brush it out into some other type of container, take it back to their land holding, and put that latex into some type of a frame, right, to be able to make then these kind of bricks that would be sold either by, an itinerant trader might come by. They might take it into town with some type of animal, or maybe if there's a road, a truck might come by. So that's kind of the system in terms of their production through 2010. Again, I haven't been there recently, so I'm not sure exactly how they're doing that now. I know some new technologies have been developed. So it's really important to understand the rubber tapper landholding or the colocação. So rubber tappers, if we think of their house maybe being at the base of this tree, a landholding is typically 3 rubber trails, and each of these rubber trails might have like 100 to 120 trees. Now, the important thing to think about is, while there are large tracts of rubber trees in this region, it's not dense. So you might have 1 or 2 trees per acre. So you can think of it, if you have 100 trees in 3 different trails, you need a lot of space. You have to have access to a lot of space to be able to make a living. Now, you saw the amount of latex that might come from one single tree. So you might cut each of these trees twice a week and have one day to kind of relax. So that's where I was suggesting that access to land is really important. You need a large area, and it's pretty labor intensive in terms of the return. You have to go a long way, and the production is not great. So anyhow, in terms of amount. So that gives you a little bit idea of the land holding. This is what maybe a land holding might look like. A little cleared area where there might be you might have a head of cattle, you might have a cow, you might have an area for pigs down in a pig pen, you have access to water, and you might plant some basic crops like, corn, or rice, beans, and manioc, maybe corn too, but rice, beans, and manioc in somewhere in the forest so the animals couldn't get to it. So that's kind of the landholding. You need a large space to be able to carry out this livelihood as a rubber tapper. Now they're also collecting Brazil nuts. That has become quite an important source of income over the last 40, 50 years as well. So, but let's go back and try to understand how rubber tapper, how this emerged and why Acre became very important for just a minute. So Charles Goodyear, invented this vulcanization process, which was very important, because before this rubber, if you think about rubber, before it developed this kind of stable state, in the hot weather it would melt, in cold weather it would be hard as a rock. So it really wasn't useful, because of the different environments at different times of the year. The vulcanization process, which took rubber and heated it with sulfur, led to establishing this stable state of rubber. So, obviously all these consumer goods were all demand for, bicycles and cars. So that put a great demand on natural rubber stands in the Amazon region. So kind of the global attention came to this region as a result of its large tracts of rubber stands. However, they needed people to work them, right? So this is in the late 1800s. There was also a drought in the northeast of Brazil. So there was this pull of saying, we can offer you opportunities in this region to make a living. And there was this push because of the extreme drought taking place here in the late 1870s. Okay, so you have this first boom of rubber tappers moving to this region. They're living alone. They're not with families. They have a place to, hang their hat. They don't have small gardens at this time. They're limited in terms of what they do. And this is the process where they smoked rubber on to make these big balls of rubber at the time, a bit different from what they've done recently. And then these balls would go to the house of the patron, or a trader in the region. The rubber baron would have a trading place there, and then they'd make their way to Manaus eventually, and in the international market. It's also important to think about how the trading system works. So you're a rubber tapper, you're kind of isolated, you're living in a kind of a hut in the forest. Your family's not there, and you're not allowed to plant crops. So how do you get goods to survive? Well, you need to sell your rubber and you need to buy supplies. I should also add that when rubber tappers came to this region, they were given free, free boat ride or a boat ride and tools, but they had to eventually pay for those. So they came, they were already in debt. And then they have these very unbalanced terms of trade where they have to pay on the left side, pay very high amounts for the goods that they purchased, any type of food, the tools. The markup was great, and they'd get a very small percentage of the rubber that they sold. So basically, they were indebted servitude. It was very difficult to get out of debt. So what happened? Henry Wickham took rubber seeds out of the Amazon region, took them to Kew Gardens in England, and then those were eventually taken to Southeast Asia and planted in plantations. So this was called our first bust. So we had a boom period, then a bust period. So what happened with the bust? Well, the rubber tappers that were there, they were indebted, right? So, and the people that owned the area that were overseeing their work and controlling their work were abandoning these areas because they were no longer profitable. So rubber tappers essentially in this time, early 1900s, 1910, 15, they went to Manaus, maybe they went back to the Northeast, but they didn't hang around because there was no way to make a living. So this is what the situation was. You have this exporting of rubber in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Then you have the production in Southeast Asia. However, and that led to the bust in the Amazon region. But then you have World War II, and that leads to the cutting off of these supplies from Southeast Asia. So that leads to a kind of a resurgence of the rubber from the Amazon region. So we have this second boom period where there's need for rubber in the global economy from this region again. So we have this big push for Brazil, the production of rubber, Brazil's role in World War II, how we can be part of that supply for the Allied powers. So once again, you have this, migration of workers to this region. And they're setting up this time more with families, right? Instead of being isolated rubber tappers in the region, they're starting to have families and maybe have some basic crops. But of course, World War II ended. That opened up the trade routes again from Southeast Asia. So once again, we had a bust period in the end of World War II. And this time, rubber tappers were generally stuck around. They were eventually kind of turned off to the autonomous rubber tapper, kind of making a living, a little bit of farming in terms of basic crops, selling rubber, maybe selling some Brazil nuts, but hanging around there instead of leaving, because now they've kind of established themselves, many of those families. But however, in the post-World War II period, we have Brazil starting to develop the Amazon, and that means investments of agro-industrial investments. So roads were built. There were government policies that favored cattle ranching in the region. So this led to purchase of lands that basically the people, the rubber barons, the people that had owned these big tracts of lands where the rubber tappers were, abandoned these areas. And ranchers were able to swoop in and pick up this land either at cut rate prices or even falsify documents to get access to the land. So you can see, having talked about what the rubber tappers need to survive, these large areas of land, right? And then we have ranchers coming in who want to do what? Deforest the land to put cattle in. It's more complex than that. Part of gaining tax breaks was to demonstrate they were using it, which part of demonstrating using it was deforesting it. So it's much more complex that I'm talking about. But the key thing is that we see these conflicts emerging between rubber tappers who are trying to make a living, plying their trade on these very large areas, and ranchers coming in and wanting to get rid of them. So how did the rubber tappers resist this and engage these conflicts in a way that we could say led to their independence? Well, first of all, community organizing. So they had very strong leaders. I'll mention Chico Mendez a bit later, but there were also many others who were very strong, charismatic leaders who were able to organize rubber tappers into certain types of protests, and I'll talk about that. There was also a rubber tapper project in the mid-'80s, the Proyecto Seringuero, and this project was about organizing communities in education, and also had some economic aspects to it and sort of trying to establish a cooperative to break down this, aviamento system that still characterized a lot of the trade there. One of the problems that Gomercindo Rodriguez mentions in his book that I have a picture of is that, initially things didn't work out as well as they'd hoped because this project was funded from the outside. So there was a question of whether, who was actually, funding this and who is actually mobilizing for this project. So it did take some time before even families from this region who had a real interest in protecting themselves from ranchers were buying in, I guess you could say, buying into this organization process. But this is one way: strong leaders, organization, walking in the forest, like he says, walking in the forest with Chico Mendez, going landholding to landholding to organize rubber tappers and let them know about the threats to their community, as well as, incentivizing community participation. Empates, nonviolent confrontation with ranchers. This was a way of peaceful protest. So ranchers were coming to their land holdings, often burning homes down, threatening households. In this period, a number of rubber tapper leaders were killed. Wilson Piñero, eventually Chico Mendez, another rapper, but others as well. So there were these very grave threats to their livelihoods. One of the things the ranchers wanted to do initially was saying, we'll pay you to leave. This happened in some cases. The question would be, well, why didn't the rubber tappers take the money and run? Well, they knew living in an urban area was a losing situation for them. They had, how are they going to survive, right? How is with someone with a minimal education going to go to an urban area and be able to survive? Here they had a large land, like they could plant on it and they could sell these extractive goods. So they confronted the workers who were coming to deforest their areas, right, sent by the ranchers. They confronted them with group efforts of peaceful protests, like circling the trees, talking to the workers who had come to cut the trees, because obviously the ranchers were hiring people to go out and, cut down the forest. So they could talk to them and say, hey, we're all in the same boat here, right? I mean, we're all workers trying to survive here in the Amazon. So these nonviolent confrontations were very important. Another important aspect was their connections with international non-governmental organizations. So if you think about what the rubber tappers wanted, they wanted protection of their spaces, right? They wanted a social space, a place to carry out their livelihoods, a place to raise their families, a place to undertake these extractive activities that had become important to them culturally and economically. What were the interests of the international non-governmental organizations? They were principally interested in, their missions were saving the forests, right? Keeping forests standing. However, you can see that they had mutual interests. And the international NGOs, this is a picture of Steve Schwartzman, who is one of the earlier people who worked for an NGO, Environmental Defense Fund, now Environmental Defense, who had a very strong relationship with Chico Mendez. And he was able to link the rubber tappers into this international community. And one of the great successes, I think, of this alliance was the fact that, these NGOs put a lot of pressure on Congress to shut down funding on the road building that was taking place in the Amazon. So, they had resources and contacts in the kind of in areas of power in the U.S. government that the rubber tappers themselves would probably never be able to get access to. So this alliance was also very important, the support of the NGOs, despite, different interests really in what they'd hoped to accomplish. They found this opportunity to work together. In the mid-1980s, one final point I want to make is this concept of the extractive reserve was established. And this was a meeting that had rubber tappers from across the country. Steve Schwartzman was there. Maria Alegrete, a Brazilian anthropologist who was also very linked to the rubber tapper movement. They formed this council, and they developed this very critical idea of an extractive reserve, in some ways developed around the establishment of indigenous reserves, where indigenous peoples were able to manage their areas. So the rubber tappers, well, we're extractivists, we live in the Amazon, and we want areas that we can manage that meet our livelihood needs. So that was a very important meeting where this concept of the extractive reserve was developed. Of course, Chico Mendes, who the reserve was initially, the reserve was named after, was a very strong force in this whole process through his contacts with international leaders, and he traveled to Washington, D.C. to attend the World Bank meeting. So he was a critical person, very charismatic leader who was able to, motivate rubber tappers to be involved politically, right? Vote, to organize, to protect your communities. Very important. And of course, he was killed in 1989. As the ranchers thought he was too big of a force to now have lobbying against them. And of course, that was a tragic moment, but also a turning point moment, one might say, because at that point, his death became such an international incident that there was global focus on this region. And that led to this, was very important in the establishment of this reserve. A film was made about that, his life. So I've talked a little bit about extractive reserves, but the key points of this are, we think about, the idea of independence, how this idea of extractive reserves really involves that idea of independence. Independence at meeting their goals, independence in the terms of them managing and monitoring other rubber tappers and how this was going to be used. The idea that this was established, that they could carry out their livelihood activities, right? Things that were important to their traditional livelihoods, as opposed to some other model of occupation. They had these large land holdings that allowed them to tap rubber or collect Brazil nuts. It gave them long-term use rights. And they built in limits in terms of how much agriculture could be carried out. So this was, again, it's a very important moment in terms of thinking about how do these rubber tapper populations develop some form of independence in this region with so much pressure from ranchers threatening their livelihood. So those were very important moments. So the reserve was established, this green area here in 1990, and it exists to this day. So rubber tapper independence, local and global movement, it certainly wouldn't have survived without the local organization by very charismatic leaders. But the global connections also were fundamental. So those international alliances were very important, as were their peaceful protests. So they weren't taking up arms against ranchers who were doing that. So it was a very successful strategy. The reserves were established, a critical social space. Again, maybe the NGOs were more interested in saving forests, keeping forests standing. It's not that they didn't have a social mission and understand what was happening, but that alliance was really important in terms of social justice and independence for the rubber tappers. I just like to say, new challenges are still there, right? Even amongst rubber tappers, there's questions. Some rubber tappers are interested in cattle production. Some are already managing timber. These are things they fought very hard against. And they're now, weighing how and debating how do you go forward in this reserve where certain ideas about a vision was established, and now there's maybe different types of visions emerging. And those include, how do you add value to these extractive products, and what products should be produced in an extractive reserve? But nonetheless, I think it's a nice story, a challenging story, a difficult story, but also one that also reflects this this desire for independence, this desire for social justice, and their ability to do that in very unique ways. So I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you very much, Rich. That was very interesting, you know, contextualizing some issues that we still see, as you mentioned, nowadays, we still face. And after Professor Brondizio's presentation, we're gonna come back and take comments and questions. Okay, thank you very much. And our next presenter is Professor Eduardo Brondizio from Indiana University, Bloomington. And his presentation's title is Green Hell or Green Heaven? Brazil's 200 years of conflicting relationship to forests. Professor Brondizio, or Eduardo Brondizio, is a distinguished professor of anthropology. He directs the Center for the Analysis of Socio-Ecological Landscapes and a senior fellow on the Ostrom Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis at Indiana University, Bloomington, where he served 2 terms as chair of the Department of Anthropology. He holds an external professorship with the Environment and Society program at the University of Campinas in Brazil. And since late 1980s, he has dedicated his research to understanding and responding to the social environmental transformation and governance challenges of Amazonia, and has been closely involved with international research programs, advancing understanding of the human dimensions of and responses to global environmental and climate change. Professor Brondizio, bem-vindo. A palavra com você. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Renato. Great to see everybody. Thank you, Renato, and thank you, Professor Porches, for organizing this panel. It's wonderful to see Richard again. As you said, we come across each other here and there. It's a wonderful opportunity. I love the talk and the analogy between the rubber tapper struggles, which continues. So we can talk about that and independence. I want to take this opportunity and the opportunity of reflecting on the 200 years of independence to reflect on this very persistent, fraught, conflicting relationship that Brazilians have with forests and with indigenous peoples, I would say. And this tension between, to put simply, the expropriation view of forests or a reconciliation view of forests that permeates our history. And I don't have a presentation as wonderful as Richard, so I hope you can follow my narrative here. But, if you're following the news recently, you have probably noticed the news about Brazil or in Brazil that deforestation is at the highest level, again, in the Amazon. And the Amazon has, it's moving from being a sink of carbon to be an emitter of carbon. You can see the same news about the Cerrado, the savannas of Brazil, that continues to be, deforested at a huge scale. And, deforestation has returned to the Atlantic forest, which we wouldn't imagine just a few years ago, and is expanding in the Caatinga. Now, so this is what you will find in the news probably this week. Now, if you last month or last year, you would probably hear Bolsonaro saying, in commenting about Amazonia, would say the Amazon is for agribusiness. That's what matters. Or the interest in the Amazon is not on the indigenous tree, nor, apologies, in the fucking trees, to use his words, but it's on mining. So that's the kind of narrative that has reappeared in Brazil. But if we look just 15, 20 years ago, the 1990s, the 2000s, you would hear things like Brazil approves the most advanced environmental constitution, anywhere. Demarcation of indigenous lands and conservation units is at an unprecedented level, including extractive reserves. Brazil reduced deforestation to historical levels. and social environmental policies recognize the rights and contributions of traditional communities. A very different scheme just, 20 years ago. And then we go back to the 70s, and I'll read a quote that I find really interesting from a very famous Amazonian ethnobotanist work in the Amazon, Richard Schultz, who wrote in the 70s, "Those who understand and love the Amazon forest call it the green haven. Those who misunderstand and despise it know it by the name of green hell." Then he makes a recent political figure, this is in the 70s, termed the Amazon as a desert of trees, which must be destroyed. And he says that unfortunately, the latter point of view seems to be now in ascendancy. And continues, why should we protect this forest? So what I'm going through different period where the relationship between, an idea of expropriating forest as an impediment for development, it's sort of, interspersed with an idea of forest and its value and the recognition of the people who live on it and who protected it. And that's a sort of a point that I want to make that, or at least a provocation that I want to make, that, this tension between reconciliation and expropriation and the ups and downs that, we go in our relationship with forest reflects a conflict and a predicament that consolidated during the independence and post-independence period. This is a thesis to be discussed, but that's what I think help us to understand this sort of very conflictus and ups and downs in our discussion. And the context of the independence, I think, is very telling and very similar in many ways, to some of the context that explains why we are at such a furious deforestation, sort of process right now. That was the context in which during the 1820s and 1830s, that deforestation really intensified in Brazil. That was the period of expanding deforestation, particularly in the Southeast. Moving from the Northeast and the coffee economy, that became dominant in the Southeast, became sort of the front of expansion of large-scale deforestation in Brazil. And of course, the consolidation of an elite and that has lands as one of the main means of of control and power and wealth in the country. So that period, I think, was really important in consolidating this sort of conflict that we still see in its ups and downs today. And the problems that we discussed today were actually very apparent in much of that period. I like to use a quote from the Patriarchy of Independence and consider sort of Brazil's first environmentalist, José Bonifácio de Andrade Silva. In 1825, he writes, "Our lands are sterile, and those few lands we have rotated are poorly cultivated. Our precious forests are disappearing victims of fire and the destructive acts of ignorance and selfishness. Our hills and slopes erode day by day. Overnight, the abundant rains that nourish the vegetation and replenish our springs and rivers will lack." That's sort of a quote that I could read for many areas of Brazil today, and that you actually find, in ways of kind of expressing the impacts of deforestation and the kind of development that we're taking. And my point here is that was consolidated during this period. And we see also that, during the period of independence and post-independence. And we see that, in the ways also Brazil enacted laws and enacted, codes to control the forest. Now, there's another point I think that relates to why we have, what explains and this persisting relationship that we have is that it was also a period that consolidated Brazil's position within the global economy of commodities. And forests as seen as this sort of infinite resource in land that can be appropriated to guarantee sources of revenue and power for the elite and for the state. And a mentality that we still see expressed today in very current political discourse, about the immensity of the Amazon, and the availability of infinite resource that can sustain our development. So part of the process that we see playing out during that period is that both elite and official narratives embraced a very expropriatory view of forests and a utilitarian view of forests, that every time there has been advances, as we have many advances over the year to change that relationship, and to recognize the importance of forests, as José Bonifácio did, in supplying resources, water, fertile soils, and climate, and so forth. Those advances are undermined by, a discourse that sort of pushes back this idea of forest there for us to expropriate, to turn into productive land, and the association between forests and unproductive land, and the lack of work ethics. And that association has become very crystallized, and it still plays out in Brazil, as if with the idea of forests as unproductive land, and people who manage forests, who depend on forests, who, know the forests as appropriators or extractivists, that are waiting for the bounty of nature and not transforming that through the idea of work ethics. And so the idea of work ethics and this concept of expropriation have run side by side in justifying, the way political leaders, official narratives, and the elite, sort of consolidate a process that is still go today, and that a lot of and most of the population of Brazil, if not, overtly, silently support, as sort of endorsing this same views. So I want to just mention, a series of steps among, of course, a long list of efforts, that have tried to sort of mediate and change that relationship with, never without struggle. And it's interesting. I mean, the relationship with forest and advances in forest, protection, code, valorization, almost always happens in a situation of scarcity. When the problem gets to a point of scarcity, that there is a sort of action, to address some of that. So, the first one of the first laws or the first decrees, right, related to forest is a royal decree from 1548. Already, because the scarcity in Brazil trees were becoming apparent. And you see another similar decree, that gives royal force in 1605, that guarantees the royalty, the property of coastal forests to mediate, of course, the very predatory nature of wood exploit at that time. In 1660, and here's something that, it's a term and a concept that is still widely used today in Brazil. You have the decree of the Madeiras de Lei, the woods under the law, if that's a good translation for it, right? Which was put in place because, depletion of resource, even at that time, was becoming very apparent. And so it was that sense of overexploitation that started that you start to see reactions. And then you have a hiatus. Then you have, sort of during the whole, from the beginning of the 1700s all the way to the independence, and almost during the entire period of the monarchy, you almost have no legislation, decrees, or reactions that aim at the protecting forest, right? It was the consolidation of large-scale ownership and expanding frontiers, right? That was, the priority at the time. We see a very similar saying after the Republic, after 1889. In both cases, you have very powerful elites, of course, behind the political process and with large interest in gaining occupation of lands and forested land, to consolidate an economy of monocrops and exports for external market. Part of this equation, and that's, I'm not going to cover it very much here, is the question of industrialization and industry and value aggregation. That has, of course, Brazil was limited to add any value aggregation or to have even basic industries to allow value aggregation in the country, and that process continued all the way to the beginning of the 1900s. And there, thus the focus becomes on really appropriating forests as raw material and land, and accumulate resource. Only in 1907 that you start to have state legislation to deal with the problems that were coming up, like the Paraná Forest Code, which was, I think, one of the first forest code, also coming after a period of, when you start to see scarcity. And then progressively, you have 1934, the first forest code, a national forest code, the water decree, one for animals, a forest council. So we have a number of events during the 1930s that really makes an advance, on protecting and reconciling and managing forests. But for each one of those processes, you have a setback, you have a reaction, you have a conflict, just like as we have now, in response to the most recent forest code, which was, heavily negotiated by interest groups of the agribusiness and others. But still, you have that pushback to revert those advances, to sort of a framing of using forest, expropriating forest resources. And that from 1937 to 1965, which had a forest code that lasted, until 2012, and that's what we have now. But that's, that's my sort of short message here, in the sense that this conflictuous relationship, has marked Brazilian history since independence, has consolidated as a frame in which force is always at the intersection, of this conflict between expropriation, reconciliation. At the same time, when you look carefully, the advances are huge and the advances are many, right? So when you look at Brazilian codes, laws, state codes, municipal codes, and the view of the public in general, we see a huge advance in recognizing the value of forest. I think perhaps, now we see that in a very public way because of, we have a better sense of the long and the largest impact of deforestation. We also have, you see a more inclusive view or dimension of forest from just utilitarian and instrumental to, more inclusive, more multidimensional, and for the cultural values and the other values that forest offers to society. So it's that kind of I would say we're still, with all these advances, in a trapped, I would call, Brazilian tragedy of the common situation, where forests are the victim as the source of resources to, to the national problems. I think to fully close that independence cycle is to fully, close our relationship to forests, and because that's a way to also reconcile, and that's the reconciliation, our relationship to the indigenous people and to traditional communities of Brazil, and to change the position of Brazil, which remains a position of source for commodity exports for others to aggregate value. And that's where, I like the title that you put in the series, because you have dependence in brackets of the independence, right? And I think that's, our challenge today. It's really to seek an independence in which the resources that Brazil has is, turned as a wealth to the population of Brazil, then to the population of this forest, and not as a resource that, adds value elsewhere and leaves scars behind, as it has been a lot of the history of deforestation in Brazil. So I'll stop here. Hope it was okay to follow my narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. That was very informative and also contextualizing, from back so far back to nowadays, how we can have a point of view about what happened, what's going on, and who knows where this is taking us. Something that came to my mind when I think both of your presentation and Rich's presentation about this utilitarian view of the forest. It has to serve to a purpose to produce something. And, it's like this endless resourceful place that we know it's not. And we see the consequences. We can talk about climate change. We can talk about the different waves that Rich mentioned about the rubber exploitation. We can think about Serra Pelada in the 80s, the gold. And we can think about the soybean production, the cattle production, the acai berry production. It's like we have all these waves that now it's the opportunity to take this. Now we're going to take that. And you can't think about the ecosystem without thinking about the water, the land, the trees, and the people, the indigenous people, the immigrants, or the people who migrated there. And as this big context, I have one question that I'm going to excuse myself to ask before asking to our audience. Is like, is there that, of your knowledge, one positive project or impactful project that you see, or an idea, or something that is in place or is going to be put in place to reverse or to address at least one or a minimum of the issues that we see these days? I'll leave it open to you guys.
That's an interesting question. There's, one initiative project, and I think there are thousands. In the following sense, a current project that I have is called Agentes, and it's an Amazonian project, and it's focused on local place-based initiatives to find solutions to these problems, right? By small scale, like rubber tapper communities, rural associations, riverine communities, all sorts of farming and fishing communities. And in documenting those initiatives, which we've been doing for a few years, of course we knew it, but you discover, a world of solutions and efforts and initiatives to deal with these problems. Most of them are invisible. So I want to, mention that there's a lot going on. There's a lot of effort, but it's always this tension that I say, it's a tension that goes back at least 200 years. Of seeing force as an impediment or something to be expropriated, and see force, as part of the economy, of the Brazilian ethos, you know, of the larger environment. So that is from the point of view of from the ground up, you're gonna find a sea of efforts to do that. Of course, they don't meet necessarily what's happening from the top down. I mean, when I read, you know, like the 80s, the 90s, or the 2000s, that's a period when many of the local initiatives actually grew to gain regional or national prominence, right? Or you have initiatives like a whole range of social environmental policies that actually allow this effort on the ground to succeed. You know, the rubber tappers is an example. It's an example in the extractive reserves that, you know, these are locally fought, as Richard said, locally fought, you know, ideas on the ground and confronting violence that have eventually gained a national, you know, sort of a place in national policy and have been able to scale up to have a much bigger impact. It solves part of the problem, and that's something we can talk about. They are faced with other problems of independence today, not least related to the value of force and the value of force resource. We haven't been able to revert that equation that exports value from the Amazon or from other regions, right? And leaving very little there. But yeah, I would say at any level, there are lots of initiatives, there are lots of efforts, lots of projects that can have contributed to that. And in different political moments, they gain amplification or they're shut down. And that is the trap that we haven't been able to overcome.
Rich, would you like to add?
No, I think what Eduardo says is a very good observation. You know, the other thing that I think we see is a lot of action at the local level, and then a lot of actions at the national level that you're wondering they don't even coincide, especially under this particular under Bolsonaro. I know you have the continuing activities at the local level that are focused maybe on social justice issues and livelihoods and poverty and, you know, feeding families, trying to get some education, increase education opportunities. But then at the other end of the spectrum, it seems like everything's working the opposite, often the opposite way. So how does that, you know, how does that work, right? I mean, it's not working because this past year, couple of years, because of the great deforestation that's taking place. And I should also mention that, you know, I was just reading just the other day when I was, you know, kind of putting this talk together, I found this old interview by Darcy Teles, and she was the first woman who was the leader of she was a girlfriend of mine in Acre. She was a rubber tapper, and we had to go over and talk to her a lot. And she's a very interesting woman. And I read this interview that she did recently, and it was talking about how the state had implemented all these programs, right? And you know, the PT and like invested a lot of money, and things were, you know, new schools and all these things. And she and she made this observation that, well, that's all great, but now they're not teaching about social justice. Now they're not teaching about organizing, you know, the importance of organization, the importance of our, you know, history. They're teaching these other you know. So it was just really interesting to think that, you know, there's so many diverse voices at the local level, and there's so many different ideas of what should be happening. I too. And so yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
I'd like to if you guys don't mind, to comment a little bit on international policies or international relations. How effective do you guys think that these international actions can be in, you know, to have an impact that is not going to punish the population, you know, that could, you know, because sometimes you see there are some sanctions, you know, that could have an impact on a policy, but also the population will suffer the consequences, not necessarily, you know, the people who are in power or are in condition to make a change or to assure like policies, because there is this pressure. You know, the world population is growing, there are more demands, and you need to be productive, and how the international market or international policies can help if they can.
Well, this is a big question because there, you know, when you talk about international relations and policy, there's so many entry points that you can take, including national commitments on international agreements, being the international agreement on climate, the international agreement on biodiversity, or, you know, others having to do with human rights and all. So there are many entry points, I think, that you can examine a question like that. What has become, you know, more visible in recent years, I would say, is on the one hand, conservation policy and conservation commitments, right? That the country is trying to meet particular expectation of conservation commitment. And on the other hand, mechanisms that regulate commodity supply chains and try to sort of use commodity supply chains, you know, as a leverage point for practices that are more environmental and socially, you know, just. So those mechanisms, as you said, there's can be always impact. You know, there's a history of conservation, which, you know, we tend to think in a very positive light, as I guess we should in many ways, but there's a history of conservation pressures and commitments and so forth that have penalized a lot of local populations because of views of conservation that, you know, exclude, you know, people from what is considered conservation. I think that the extractive reserves very early on, very early in this discussion, because it doesn't affect only Brazil, this is an international issue, offer an alternative, you know, that could reconcile local use of force and conservation status. Run into all sorts of problems, as Richard knows much better than I do, in terms of, you know, the economic viability, right? And you know, it didn't change the position of the actors within larger economic chains, and therefore they couldn't make it viable, you know, to conserve forests without having markets that really, you know, would not as disadvantageous, just as, you know, as they are. Now, the mechanism for supply chain, particularly cattle and soybean, you know, they are playing an important role because, you know, they sort of are a leverage point to distribute responsibility across the supply chain, right? Now, whether they're effective or not is another question. And, you know, some mechanisms may be more effective and so forth. It's very hard in a region like the Amazon where, you know, you have, for instance, for cattle ranching and beef, you know, you have market mechanisms that regulate the source of beef and cattle ranching, but they get a piece of, you know, the bigger pie because of the lack of ways of controlling, the lack of the presence of the state, no mechanism for monitoring, you know, so in theory can be a great mechanism for diminishing deforestation, but in practice, you know, sort of the infrastructure is not there to make them work. So I'll stop here.
I wonder if we have any questions or observations from our attendees.
I don't think so. I mean, I've asked also if anybody had any questions. There's been some comments on social media, but then just been general comments thanking and saying that people are learning a lot, as I am as well. And so, but no specific questions that I have that we've received, specific questions anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So I would like to thank all the participants, Professor Denise Borges for helping us.
There is one question from Dr. David Ross, Professor Emeritus from Fresno State. David asks, is it possible to anticipate changes in policy if Lula is elected?
That's a really good question. I mean, a lot of the, I'll speak just a little bit on that. The government plan for Lula is not very explicit so far, and actually not publicly available for most of it. So it's very hard to see, what are the commitments at this point of the election when we don't have, an actual plan to do that. What I would expect is that, the infrastructure and the monitoring infrastructure and the government infrastructure that has been completely dismantled, to be very clear, is put back in place, at the minimum. So we have minimal capacity for monitoring the region, for supporting or for limiting the scale of illegal economies that have taken place in regions like the Amazon. The legal economic chains in the region have expanded enormously. And that's a very complex issue that we didn't have 10 years ago as much, right? But when legal economic changes means that, you have a drug route that is, much more consolidated today and is plaguing municipalities that are large and very small all along the channel. You have illegal economies for fisheries, for logging, for mining, for cattle. The region has become, a cradle of illegal economies. So, in part because you have a narrative that empowers that, and you don't have infrastructure, to even pay attention to that. I visit many parts of the region this year, and the ICMB or IBAMA bases are completely deactivated, as are many of the FUNAI bases. And you just don't have capacity. So at minimum, I would expect, to restore, the presence of government and restore even a little bit the rule of law, which, has been dismantled in the region in recent years. The problems have become a lot more complex because now you don't have only the illegal cattle ranching or, agribusiness deforestation, which is plenty out of there. Actually, most of the deforestation in the region is illegal, legally illegal, or legally illegal. It's redundant, but it's illegal. But today you have money washing through deforestation, through logging, through fishing. So much more complex chains, economic chains that are at play. So I would think that there be also a reconstitution of FUNAI. I would hope that. And, sort of a different narrative that recognizes, all the actors on the ground who are doing stuff, who are, sort of have their rights, and they have been, put in a situation of coercion in many cases, or, threats and so forth. So the situation in the region hasn't been difficult, talking just about a small part of the problems in the region. But I would expect that at least at minimal, we would sort of, reinstitute minimal presence of the government and the rule of law in the region that gives protection, to the people on the ground. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ross. I don't know if Professor Wallace has anything to add to that as well.
Well, I would just add that if we look, and correct me, Eduardo, if I get off step here, but, when Lula was elected last time, he did put a lot of effort into social programs at the local level, and that had a big impact. So I suspect forest people of all types will be looking at that and hoping that something is, there are funds that go to the local level to support livelihoods. And I I would think that would be something that might happen, especially as Eduardo was mentioning, just some of the legal mechanisms at the local level and enforcement and those things would certainly get support. But also, and again, I haven't been following things, other than hearing articles in the news and some things coming out that, Lula was a pretty strong supporter of agribusiness when he was in office. So you don't see that disappearing, right? So that's an important sector of the Brazilian economy. So that's something that, caused some conflicts, right, in his administration, particularly with environmentalists. So how that will, that's a sector that is going to have to be negotiated with, or in some way, something's going to have to happen there. But from past experience, that hasn't, growth of that sector has gone along with, doing these other things that Eduardo was talking about. So it will be interesting.
I agree. During his time, he was a supporter of social environmental policy and agribusiness policy, but it was a very different time. It was a time in which they could both expand in parallel, and the social environmental problems became the mechanism to hold back deforestation a little bit, right? But the situation today is very different. The region is very different. All those things are intertwined today. Right. They are all intertwined. It's a very different space than it was 10 years ago, and much more complex collective action problems that, requires people to bring to the table the large agribusiness, the indigenous group, the small farmers who all share the same watershed, right? Or who, whose action here, it's affecting the neighbor next door. So it's there's a very significant issue of bridging social capitals and connections between groups that are very different, have very different views of the forest, that 10, 15 years ago had their own space to take care of, and today are, intertwined in, as Eleanor Ostrom would say, in a lattice of interdependence. A much more difficult challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'd like to then take the opportunity to thank you both who presented and brought us a lot of information and hope on the Amazon issues or conflicts. At least information is a very important and powerful tool that we can use towards managing or addressing some of the issues that we face. And thank you very much for your brilliant presentations, and Professor Richard Wallace from CSU Stanislaus, and Professor Eduardo Brondizio from Indiana University, Bloomington. And also, Denise, obrigado por me convidar. Thank you for adding CSU Stan to your plans, and I'll pass it to you.
Well, thank you. I want to thank also Professors Brondizio and Wallace. It was amazing. It was very enlightening. I learned tremendously. I have about 2 pages of notes because it was really, really informative. And it's such an important topic and an important part that sometimes we in America just shy away from. We don't want to know about these issues. We want to know about samba and football and all, and some of the wonderful Brazilian food, but then we don't want to know about all these other issues that affect the Brazilians and affect us all in throughout the globe. So thank you both for sharing your knowledge, your time, your expertise with us. Thanks to those who provided questions as well at the end. Thanks to Professor David Ross and everyone else. Thank you also for the link. And once again, on behalf of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute from Fresno State, CSU Stanislaus, Thanks to FLAD, Luso American Development Foundation, for sponsoring this third day of a program that will culminate tomorrow at the same time. Same space, same link, and it will be with 4 members of the Brazilian diaspora here, communities in California, Central, Southern, and Northern California, and some music as well. So once again, thanks to Professor Brondizio, Professor Wallace, thanks to my good friend and colleague, Professor Renato Alvim, and to all of you for joining us. Take care. Viva Brazil and the 200th celebration of the independence. Muito obrigado a todos.
Just as a note for the, a word of hope that Renato said, I'm sharing a link to a series of about 15 videos that they were locally produced, but as part of this collaboration in the Agents Project, of very, very local initiatives, trying to solve problems at the local level. I think this is where a lot of the hope, I think, is. So please share it further as well.
Thank you. I
will. It was great seeing you again.
You too, Eduardo. I hope we run into each other soon.
Me too. Yeah.
Muito obrigado a todos.
Denise e Renato. Muito obrigado.
Boa noite.
Muito obrigado, gente.
Obrigadíssimo.
Tchau.
Tchau.